not sure exactly what her specifics are. She wanted to talk about the wider conversation. I'm looking for the specifics. I've got Susan Smith, Director for Women Scotland. Good morning, Susan.
Hello.
Hi. You have troubles with the Scottish legislation, the Gender Recognition Reform Act. Presumably, you are happy that Westminster has intervened. Are you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've had a lot of reaction from women on all sides of the political debate. You know, long-term independent supporters, people who supported devolution, people who support Devo Max, who are absolutely delighted that the Westminster government has intervened and stopped what was a potentially very serious upset to women's rights in Scotland.
Right. Can you give me the specifics? What are your concerns?
Yeah. So what we have been told, and the Scottish Government has gone round and round the houses about this, are the effects. We asked the Scottish Government repeatedly what they thought the effects of getting a GRC were. Now, you hear someone like Katie Montgomery who claims that they have no effects. This is not true. We took a judicial review we had a ruling just before Christmas, and Lady Haldane said that a GRC changes a person's sex for all purposes under the Equality Act. So that's a serious and substantial thing, because when you're talking about data collection, when you're talking about recording gender pay gaps, when you're talking about political representation or women's shortlists, etc., what we are being told is this piece of paper, which may be given to anybody for whatever reason, will change their sex. Now, Shona Robertson and others have said that the exceptions in the Equality Act still apply. This is also true, but this means that services have to take a different basis on exclusion. So if they wish to exclude someone who is legally female, they have to then frame an exclusion in a different way. They have to frame it on the grounds of gender reassignment, and they have to provide an extra level, we would assume, of proof that these people should not be in a woman's space. So it comes down to really, do you think women have the right to their own spaces? Do they have the right to political representation? Do we have the right to talk about ourselves as a sex class? Do we have the right to have healthcare provision and all that sort of thing?
But when you say women,
carve-out.
Are you saying then that somebody who's in possession of a gender recognition certificate is not a woman?
Well, not biologically, no. And I think we have to stop this nonsense and this talking about legal fictions in this way. There are two sexes, and no human being has ever changed their sex. And the majority of people who now claim to be trans have no medical interventions whatsoever. We are talking about people who are physically, biologically now indistinguishable from anyone else. This process, and there was a process before, now what the Scottish Government wanted was to completely remove the process. They talk about simplification. Simplification would mean that the process was still open to the same cohort. It isn't. They have taken away any link to gender dysphoria, and they've now opened it up to anybody. And they talk about living in an acquired gender. They have no definition for what that means. And in fact, how could they? Because it would be hugely sexist. How does one live as a woman? So most of this bill is built on fluff and nonsense, because it also, by the way, has no mention of transgender anywhere in the bill. The idea of 16-year-olds, for example, what we don't know is how that will affect schools. A 16-year-old boy will have gone through no medical process. They will be indistinguishable from their male peers in the school. Potentially, they're talking about now going off on a school trip and staying in the same room as teenage girls. And I think we all know that's a recipe for a safeguarding disaster.
So, whilst the argument for this reform would be to make it easier for people to live in their chosen gender, to get the gender recognition certificate, and which is not an absolute prerequisite for living in your chosen gender, has to be said. But, you know, the argument would be to make it easier for people, for trans people. You think it makes it too easy, and I know I'm simplifying here, but you know, there's a lot of people who'll be listening in this morning thinking, wow, what is this all about? You think it makes it too easy for people to live in another gender?
Well, yeah, and I think actually what this has done is it's opened. It's very bad actually for transsexuals, who a lot of whom are very opposed to this, because it's opened up a whole conversation about what do we mean by transgender? What do we mean by living in an acquired gender? Nobody has any idea. Nobody has any definition. We are talking about sexist stereotypes. And I think for a lot of people now, we're in a position where we say, let's just get back to sex, because I don't care how somebody wants to present. I don't care whether a male person wants to have long hair or wear a dress. But I do care that we are then pretending that they are indistinguishable from women, because they are not. Women have unique needs, and we have suffered because of sexism and continue to suffer because of sexism.
Okay.
And I don't think that needs to be rubbed out in society.
Okay. All right. Well, Susan, listen, thank you for expressing your views. Some people will agree with them, some people won't. That's the nature of a debate. I'm going to bring in Professor Sophie Grace-Chappell, who's the Chair of Philosophy at the Open University. Good morning to you, Sophie.
Good morning.
Good morning. You've listened to Susan's concerns here about these changes. How would you respond to them?
Well, I think if we go back to the Equality Act 2004, what that says is that for most purposes, people who have a gender recognition certificate are legally female, but with due cause for a legitimate end, you can exclude them from some spaces. So suppose you have a rape centre, a rape crisis centre, a group of people discussing past trauma, a group of women discussing past trauma, and one of them is uncomfortable with a trans woman being included in that group, that would be a legitimate cause for excluding that trans woman from that discussion. Now, changing gender recognition...
Would you be prepared to be excluded from that discussion?
Well, I'm not in the situation, and potentially I could see myself saying, sure, if you're uncomfortable, then fine, I'll step aside. But the point I'm making is that this is a very fine discrimination, because the law says for most purposes, if you have a gender recognition certificate, then you're legally that gender. Exceptions can be made, but what your question brings out is how rare those exceptions are going to be. So if this is what all the fuss is about, then Westminster does not need to attempt to block the Act. We need to go down the other line that Alistair Jack has suggested and negotiate over this fine detail. But the trouble is, you see, I don't think they're interested just in this fine detail. I don't think they're interested in the detail at all. Westminster itself was on course to introduce a Self-ID Act right up until August 2020, when the last Conservative Prime Minister but one, Boris Johnson, kicked the whole process into touch in August 2020. It had been going on for 3 years, public consultations. People have been very clear that they wanted self-ID in the UK. That was the overwhelming majority of the responses they were getting. But the government didn't like what they were hearing from the people, so they kicked it into touch. Now Scotland is trying to go down this line, and the complaint is that Scotland is out of step with the rest of the UK, and that there's a conflict between Scotland's Act and the UK's Act. Well, in the first place, as I've just shown, if there is a conflict with the 2004 Equalities Act, it's a very small one, which can be sorted out in a back room by a couple of lawyers in an afternoon.
Right. Well, Alistair Jack has...
And secondly...
Alistair Jack has said that he would invite the Scottish Government to make amendments. They say that they're not going to make amendments because they don't see any need to make amendments. Okay,
well, if they're confident or that the Act as it stands doesn't violate the 2004 legislation, then fine. But the other thing I want to say about this is where do we stop? If we accept this principle that acts passed in Scotland by devolved powers can be blocked if they get in the way of UK-wide legislation.
Well, but see, there we are. We're getting onto... See, this is us getting onto the political discussion. So, I guess this comes back to, and people will have their thoughts on this, whether or not this action by Westminster is essentially a political act, the nuclear option, etc., a sign of things to come, as we've heard Scottish ministers say today, or whether or not it is a genuine objection to a piece of legislation that they think will impact negatively on some people's lives. Susan, can I come back to you? You clearly don't think it's political. You think it is a legitimate concern. Sophie Grace thinks it's political.
It's
largely.
Definitely legitimate, because the Scottish Government were warned. They were warned by lawyers, they were warned by the HRC that there were issues under the Equality Act. In fact, they made exactly the same argument to the HRC in court in RJR. the EHRC intervened on their behalf. So they have accepted the EHRC's argument that there's an impact on the Equality Act. Now, yes, Westminster potentially have the option to strengthen the Equality Act and potentially repeal parts of the GRA, and we would welcome that too. But I don't think Sophie would. And this is an instrument that was voted for. Section 35 was voted for by the SNP. It is part of the devolved settlement. It is democracy in action. There were other things Sophie said there that were blatantly untrue, actually. The consultation in the UK, the results were never revealed. What they think they showed was that there was overwhelming opposition. All the most recent results of consultations in Scotland, the call for evidence to the committee, showed opposition to this. So actually, the more people become aware of the implications of this, the more they're opposed. And I think what we have to say is this was a democratic instrument that was used because we have a situation in Scotland where we have reserved and devolved legislation. And while the British government have power over the GR, Scotland have power over birth and death certificates. They really do not have the power to change the operation of equality law in the UK, and that is the fundamental issue here.
Okay, I'm going to read some of the text that we're getting in because people have clearly been listening very intently to the discussion. Probably predictably, perhaps a bit more reluctant to call in, though we do have Tommy from the Highlands, and Tommy, I'll speak to you in just a second. 08085 92 95 00 is the number to call. I mean, if you have got any questions, then I'm sure that our contributors that we have here would be more than happy to field them if indeed they are genuine questions. But let me just try and get some sense of where you're thinking here. Ross from Bearsend said a number of polls on the GRR bill show the vast majority of the public are against it, showing how out of touch this SNP government is with Scotland's priorities. I'm agnostic on the gender recognition issue, says Jim and Dunblane. However, your caller Katie, that's Katie Montgomery, deserves huge praise for the way she calmly and rationally made her point. She certainly educated me about the reality of what the Act bill, yes, is it an Act or is it a bill? You're right, means rather than the rhetoric. Thank you, Katie. Trans rights, there seems to be some inherent belief that trans people are perverts and or sexual deviants and would be predators if in female-only environments. This belief is insulting and bigoted. It is simply not the case. Actually, I'm going to throw that one to you, Susan, because I've heard this one a lot. I mean,
yes.
Is that what you believe, that trans people are inherently dodgy?
No, this is a not all men argument, isn't it? What we say is that male people have a higher propensity, sadly, for sexual violence. 98 to 99% of sexual violence is committed by men. And that does not change with transition. So there's already the same risk with having people who are biologically male, whatever. Some men are the nicest men in the world, some are perfectly safe. But this is the same as, it's not my Nigel argument. So we're not saying they're all necessarily predatory, but we're also saying that women have the right to privacy. So if you go into a changing space, you have a right not to see a naked man in there if you don't really want to. And of course, voyeurism and exposure are all part of sexual violence.
You're denying. You're kind of denying that an individual can change gender, aren't you? Really, Susan, at the crux of this.
Well, yes, but I also think.
But, I mean, that is really key, isn't it?
For most people, if you see somebody standing there, full frontal naked, you know what their sex is. You're not going to look into their soul and say, well, they've got a lady spirit, so they're not going to attack me. You're not going to know.
Okay, Sophie Grace, I want you to respond to that. Because, hang on, Susan. Sophie Grace, can you respond to that? Because I think this is really getting down to the crux of this.
Well, I'm pretty horrified by this kind of scaremongering about trans people and this kind of depiction of trans people. First of all, we're all trans women, apparently. Actually, some of us are trans men. That's the first point. Secondly, we're all biologically male. Well, people change, actually. People do change. One of the things that people from the gender critical side like to say very often is, oh, this person's taken so many hormones during their life of medication that they change completely. So, which is it? Either our hormones, all the drugs we take, changes completely from males, or we remain predators. They can't make their mind up. And behind that are some facts about the trans community. First, I, as a trans person, I would not go into a mixed changing room. I would because I don't think that I need to be that pushy. I don't need to find that kind of confrontation. And secondly, trans people are very various. We're really very various. Some of us are physically, some trans women are physically indistinguishable and indistinguishable to most doctors unless they take a DNA test from natal women. So I think there's a lot wrong with this argument because it lumps trans people all into the same category and then vilifies that category. And that seems to me very bad. Can I come back to something that was said before about democracy?
Yep.
It was said democracy is expressed in the Section 35 order that Alistair Jack is apparently about to give. Well, here's the thing to think about if we want to talk about democracy. No one voted for Alistair Jack to be Scottish Secretary. No one voted for Rishi Sunak to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. In 2 elections in succession, the SNP and the Greens have won the election at Holyrood on a platform which clearly includes a commitment to self-ID, something which, as I said before, the UK as a whole was committed to before 2018. Yeah. So you've got an elected government against a minister who, in that role, is unelected.
Yeah, well, it is the way our system works. It is the way our system. Nobody voted for Gordon Brown when he succeeded Tony Blair. There are numerous examples of that, Sophie Grace. But I mean, I get what you're saying.
I think they've got a bit of brass neck, putting themselves in this position. Rishi Sunak. Well, if they're so keen on this principle, they should dissolve Parliament and call an election. Let's see if the population really support an election. The last time in Scotland we had 2.
Okay, with respect, Sophie Grace, I do think we're wandering off the point there. But clearly, the political nature of this is unavoidable. I've got to have a wee break in a second, but hang on, I'm going to bring in Kevin Schofield, political editor of HuffPost UK. Kevin, good morning to you.
Morning, Kay.
And thank you for your patience. It's a very interesting discussion, but you know, there's many aspects to it. And as I say, I'm sure people listening this morning will be, their heads might be bumping a little bit. In your view, to what extent is this largely political mudslinging? Or is there a genuine concern here on the part of the Westminster government about a clash with equalities legislation? Or is that just a fig leaf to have a pot shot at the Scottish government, which is what the Scottish government is more or less contending?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's a fig leaf. I mean, the people I've spoken to in the UK government, I get the impression that they're not taking this decision lightly, but they're doing it for political gain. And there is a genuine belief that the law that's been passed in Scotland would impact the application of looking at across the UK.
Kevin, I'm really sorry. We're going to have to try and sort out that line. I'm just struggling to hear you.
Join me, Mark Stephen, as I head to the Cairngorms for Thunder.